The studio was set, the cameras were rolling, the audience was ready. But no one, not the producers, not the viewers at home, not even the smug host sitting across the table, had any idea that in the next few minutes the internet was about to explode. The lights were blinding, the kind that made most guests sweat, even when they weren't nervous. But Sylvester Stallone? He wasn't nervous. He sat back in his chair, relaxed, composed, waiting. His broad frame made the expensive studio chair seem small. He had been in the industry for decades. He had seen it all. Across from him sat Ethan Caldwell, slick, sharp, trained for this moment. A man who had built his reputation by making high-profile guests squirm. His show thrived on what he called critical conversations, but what his critics knew were nothing more than well-rehearsed verbal traps. And tonight, his target was Stallone. "Mr. Stallone," Ethan began, his voice dripping with confidence, "you've always been known as a symbol of old-school masculinity. But do you think that kind of toughness is outdated? In today's world, isn't it time we redefine strength to be more inclusive?" The audience chuckled. Some nodded in agreement. His fans were already anticipating another takedown, another viral moment where he would expose an aging celebrity as out of touch. But Stallone? He just blinked, slowly, deliberately. Then he exhaled through his nose, leaned forward slightly, and in a calm, gravelly voice asked, "You mean, do I think being tough is a bad thing now?" Ethan smirked, sensing control. He had set the trap. "Well," he said, adjusting his tie, "I think we're past the era where men need to punch their way through problems. Don't you think the world has moved on from that?" Silence, not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that forces people to shift in their seats, wondering who would break it first. Stallone scratched his chin. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a deep, genuine belly laugh. "You're serious?" he asked, shaking his head. "You think toughness is a problem?" Ethan straightened, sensing his narrative slipping. "I think it can be toxic when it discourages vulnerability, yes." Stallone nodded slowly, like he was processing the thought. Then he leaned back, stretching his arms across the back of his chair, completely unfazed. "Let me ask you something," he said, voice dropping lower, deliberate. "If someone broke into your house tonight, do you want a tough guy in there? Or do you want someone who's going to sit down and talk about their feelings?" The audience let out an audible gasp. A few clapped. Others glanced at each other, processing the weight of the question. Even some of Ethan's crew members exchanged glances. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Stallone wasn't done. "Toughness ain't about punching walls or yelling the loudest," Stallone continued. "It's about standing your ground when life knocks you down. It's about protecting your family. It's about discipline, respect, hard work. And if you think the world doesn't need that anymore," he shook his head, "then I don't know what world you're living in, man." Ethan forced a chuckle, but something had changed. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. He had gone into this expecting an easy win, another guest who would fumble, trip over their words, get defensive. But Stallone wasn't playing along. He wasn't folding. He was hitting back, and the audience could feel it. Ethan shuffled his cue cards, trying to regain control. "All right," he said, smoothing his voice. "But don't you think Hollywood, and let's be honest, your own movies, have glorified violence as the only solution to problems?" Stallone exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Hollywood glorifies a lot of things," he said. "You ever seen a movie where a guy saves the world by filling out paperwork?" Laughter. Real laughter. This time it wasn't just from the audience. It was from the camera crew, the people behind the scenes who had heard 1,000 interviews before, but had never seen one go off script like this. Ethan wasn't ready to back down. "But Stallone," he said, shifting in his seat, "you've built an entire career on playing characters who solve problems with their fists. Don't you ever think about the message that sends? Don't you feel a responsibility to promote a more progressive kind of hero? The way he emphasized the word progressive made it clear where he was leading the conversation. Stallone smirked. He sat up, rolling his shoulders like a boxer before the next round. "First of all," he said, voice steady, "I make movies. Movies ain't real. You know that, right?" He raised an eyebrow. "I mean, last time I checked, I never actually went 15 rounds with Apollo Creed. Never took down a whole army with a red bandana and a knife. Never ran up those steps in Philly and single-handedly fixed people's problems." The audience chuckled, some even clapping. "But," Ethan interjected, "movies shape culture. Kids grow up watching Rambo and Rocky. Don't you think we should be giving them heroes who solve problems without violence?" Stallone exhaled through his nose, shaking his head again. "Man, you ever seen Rocky?" he asked. "That whole movie was about getting back up when life knocks you down. It wasn't about beating people up. It was about heart, perseverance. And Rambo?" He shrugged. "That guy was just trying to be left alone. If people had just let him walk through town and mind his business, none of that would have happened." The audience clapped louder this time. A few even whistled. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't going the way he had planned, but he wasn't giving up. He leaned forward, changing tactics. "Okay, fair enough," he said, his voice softer, more personal. "But let's talk about the real world. Right now, people are questioning what it means to be a man. Some would argue that your version of toughness, the old school, don't show weakness kind, is part of the problem, that it creates more division than unity." Stallone let the question hang in the air. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, eyes locked on Ethan. Then, his voice dropped even lower. "You ever meet a firefighter?" Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" "A firefighter," Stallone repeated. "A cop, a guy in the military. Hell, even a single mom working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. You ever talk to those people? You think toughness is their problem?" Ethan didn't answer. Stallone shook his head. "No, man. Their toughness is what keeps the world running. The problem ain't toughness. The problem is people thinking strength is something bad, like it's dangerous. Weakness ain't a virtue, pal. Strength with control. That's what keeps people safe." The crowd erupted. Some clapped, some murmured. Even Ethan's camera crew exchanged glances. Ethan swallowed. He had another question lined up, another attempt to turn the tide. But something had changed. The audience wasn't nodding along with him anymore. They were waiting for Stallone's next words. And Stallone? He wasn't letting up anytime soon. Ethan Caldwell was losing control of the interview, and he knew it. His show thrived on exposing contradictions, on making old-school icons stumble over their own words. But tonight, the game wasn't going as planned. Stallone wasn't defensive. He wasn't stumbling. He was standing his ground, and worse, he was winning over the audience. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to regain control, fast. He adjusted his tie, forced a small chuckle, and leaned forward. Time to shift tactics. "All right, Stallone," he said, keeping his tone light. "Let's move away from toughness for a second. I want to talk about something else. Your career. You've played some of the most iconic roles in history. Rocky, Rambo, The Expendables. But some critics argue that these roles are all the same, that you've spent decades playing just one kind of man, the tough silent type who punches first and talks later. What do you say to that?" Stallone tilted his head, as if the question amused him. "Let me ask you something," he said, scratching his chin. "You ever see Copland?" Ethan blinked. He hadn't expected that. Sure, a long time ago." "Yeah?" Stallone smirked. "Then you know I played a half-deaf, overweight sheriff who never threw a single punch in that movie, didn't shoot a gun, didn't fight an army. And guess what? Critics called it one of my best performances," the audience murmured. Some nodded. Others were clearly intrigued. Stallone wasn't done. "What about Rocky Balboa?" he continued. "You remember that speech? The one about life hitting harder than any man? That was about resilience, not violence." "And Rambo, First Blood?" He leaned in. "You know what people forget? That movie wasn't about a war hero killing people. It was about a man who wanted peace but kept getting pushed until he had no choice. The audience clapped. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had walked into his own trap. He had expected Stallone to be the stereotype. Instead, Stallone was making him look like the one who hadn't done his research. Ethan exhaled, forcing a polite smile. "Fair enough," he said. "But let's talk about something more recent. You've been in Hollywood for decades, but in the past few years, we've seen a shift. Studios are prioritizing new kinds of heroes, heroes who are more emotionally vulnerable, more introspective, and some people say that your style of action hero is outdated, that audiences don't want it anymore." Stallone just stared at him. Then, slowly, he started laughing again. "Outdated?" he repeated. "That's funny, man. You know what the highest-grossing movies of the last few years have been?" Ethan hesitated. He knew where this was going. Stallone didn't wait for an answer. Top Gun: Maverick, a movie about an old-school, no-nonsense fighter pilot. John Wick, a guy who barely talks, fights for what he believes in, and never backs down. The Equalizer, a strong, disciplined man taking down bad guys. And you want to know something? He smirked. Audiences love it. The crowd erupted into cheers. Ethan forced another chuckle, but there was tension in his posture now. He had expected Stallone to be defensive. Instead, Stallone was calm, confident, completely in control. Still, Ethan wasn't ready to give up. He had one more card to play. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Let's talk about your personal life," he said. "You've been through some tough times, a difficult childhood, rejections, financial struggles, and, of course, the tragic loss of your son." The air in the studio shifted instantly, a pin-drop silence, the kind that made even the cameramen hold their breath. Stallone's jaw tightened. His eyes darkened. For the first time all night, his expression changed. Not anger, not annoyance, something deeper. Pain. Ethan knew he had touched a nerve, and he was counting on it. "Losing a child is something no parent should ever go through," Ethan continued. "But in your case, it happened while the whole world was watching. How did that affect you? How did it shape the way you see the world?" More silence. The audience wasn't sure whether to lean in or look away. Stallone exhaled slowly. His fingers tapped against the armrest. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "You want to know how it affected me?" he said. "It broke me. No performance, no bravado, just raw truth." Ethan sat up, sensing the moment. This was what he wanted, a crack in the armor. But then Stallone continued. "But here's the thing," he said. "Pain like that, it doesn't go away. You don't move on. You carry it every day. Some days it crushes you. Other days, you stand up anyway." He looked Ethan dead in the eyes. And that's why toughness matters. Ethan's smirk vanished. Stallone's voice didn't waver. "See, a lot of people think toughness is about not feeling anything, that it means shoving emotions down, pretending nothing hurts. That ain't toughness. Real toughness is feeling everything and still showing up." The audience was dead silent, not out of discomfort, out of respect. Stallone leaned forward. "You ever lose someone, Ethan?" Ethan blinked. He wasn't expecting the question to be thrown back at him. I mean, we all lose people." "No," Stallone interrupted. "I mean, have you ever lost someone who was your whole world?" Ethan hesitated. The silence stretched. Then, finally, he sighed. "Yeah," he admitted, "I have." Stallone nodded. "Then you know," he said quietly. "You know what it's like to wake up every morning and feel that weight. And you know what it takes to get out of bed anyway, to keep going, to keep pushing forward even when it feels like the world just wants you to fall apart." Ethan swallowed. He had started this conversation trying to expose Stallone, but somehow the tables had turned. Stallone sat back. "You want to talk about what kind of heroes people need today?" he said. "They don't need perfect heroes. They don't need men who never struggle. They need men who fight through the struggle, who feel pain and still protect the people they love, who keep standing no matter how hard life knocks them down. He gestured toward the audience. Look around, man. People ain't looking for someone to tell them toughness is bad. They're looking for someone to remind them that it's okay to be strong, that it's okay to fight for what matters, that it's okay to not give up. Silence, then applause. First, a few hesitant claps, then more and more, until the entire studio was on its feet. Even Ethan's crew members, who were supposed to remain neutral, were clapping. Ethan sat frozen, realizing something he had lost. Not because Stallone had humiliated him, not because he had been exposed, but because Stallone had won the audience. And in this game, that was the only victory that mattered. The applause roared through the studio, but Ethan Caldwell barely heard it. His own show had just turned against him. Sylvester Stallone sat back in his chair, calm, composed, victorious. His words still echoed in the air. Ethan had two choices: end the interview now and salvage his pride, or go for one last strike. He forced a smile, pretending to be unfazed. All right, Stallone, he said. I'll admit, you make a strong argument, but let's be real. The world is changing. Toughness alone isn't enough anymore. People want heroes who talk about emotions, who embrace vulnerability. Stallone didn't blink. You think I don't? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Do you? Stallone leaned in. I just told you about losing my son. I just told you how it broke me. You think that's easy to say? Ethan hesitated. I grew up with nothing, Stallone continued. I was told I'd never make it. I had to sell my own dog just to survive. That's not a tough guy story. That's a man who was desperate, who was hurting, who had no options left. But I never stopped believing. And when I finally got my break, when Rocky finally got made, I bought my dog back. That's not just toughness, that's heart. The audience erupted into cheers again. Ethan clenched his jaw. The interview was slipping further from his control. Stallone wasn't just winning, he was inspiring. Ethan needed a final move, something that would put him back in charge. He exhaled and leaned forward. Okay, he said. Since we're being honest, tell me this. What's your biggest regret? The studio went silent. For the first time all night, Stallone's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His fingers interlocked. He looked away for a moment as if the answer weighed on him. Then he looked back at Ethan. My biggest regret, he repeated, not saying I love you enough. The room shifted. Ethan hadn't expected that. The audience hadn't expected that. Stallone's voice was lower now. You spend years thinking you have time, he said, that you'll always have another chance to say what you feel. Then, one day, time runs out. Ethan swallowed. You mean with your son? Stallone nodded. And others, friends, family, people who were there one day and gone the next. You get so caught up in being strong that you forget strength isn't just about fighting. It's about saying the things that matter before it's too late. The audience was motionless. No one coughed. No one whispered. Even Ethan felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a moment. Stallone sat back. You want to talk about what heroes should be today, he said. They should be men who know when to fight and when to speak, when to stand strong and when to say, I love you. The silence held. Then one person in the audience clapped, then another, until the entire studio was on its feet, applauding louder than before. Ethan just sat there, stunned. He had come into this interview thinking he would expose a relic of the past. Instead, he had witnessed something undeniable. Not a tough guy, not just a legend. A man who had nothing left to prove, because he had already won. The camera zoomed in on Stallone's face, capturing the final shot, a shot that would go viral, a shot that would be remembered. The interview that changed everything.